They say revenge is sweetest when it's cold. But what if revenge didn't roar? What if it arrived quietly, deliberately, reshaping everything in its path before anyone even noticed? For Caitlin Clark, that moment came not with headlines, not with press conferences, not with social media drama. It came in silence, in control, in a single decision that shattered expectations and rattled the power structure of women's basketball. She walked away from over $1 million in just 8 weeks of play. Most athletes would have taken it without hesitation, but she didn't. Why? Because this wasn't about money. It was about authority, about timing, about rewriting the rules of a game and a system that had long underestimated her. Tonight, we trace the ripple effects of that choice. The moment one misread, one oversight by the most powerful voices in women's basketball, collided with the rise of a player who refused to ask permission. And the consequences, they changed everything. The phone call that never came. Every legendary downfall starts with a misread. And Geno Auriemma's mistake was not a bad rotation or a loss in March. It was far deeper than that. It was a blind spot shaped by decades of dominance. A choice to overlook something that was standing right in front of him, and a level of arrogance so comfortable that it stopped feeling like arrogance at all long before Caitlin Clark became the face of the sport, before packed arenas and record television numbers and national awards that rewrote the history books.
Smith Trophy for the most outstanding women's college basketball player. Caitlin Clark.
She was just a kid from Des Moines, Iowa, chasing a hoop dream, and like countless young players before her, when that dream pointed straight to UConn. It was not just a school. It was a standard, the dynasty everyone measured themselves against. A factory for greatness that produced icons like Diana Taurasi, Maya Moore, and Breanna Stewart. UConn was power, history, and dominance wrapped into a single name. For Clark, it represented the peak, the ultimate destination, the place that defined what success in women's basketball was supposed to look like. When recruitment rolled around, everything seemed lined up perfectly. A generational scorer with deep range and court vision beyond her years, knocking on the door of the most decorated coach the game had ever seen. On paper, it looked automatic, but reality hit differently. The connection never formed. The door did not swing open the way people expected, and that disconnect and that single missed handshake would end up shaping everything that followed. By Clark's own account, the interest from UConn was never serious. Geno's staff made light contact through her AAU coach. A quick call here, a casual check-in there. But Geno himself never reached out directly. He never called Caitlin Clark. He never spoke to her parents. That silence said everything. She was not a priority. And when questions came up later about why the most obvious recruit in the country had slipped through his fingers, Geno's response revealed exactly how comfortable he had become at the top. He said he had already committed early to Paige Buchers and did not want 2 point guards in the same class. On the surface, that explanation sounded reasonable enough. But then came the part that crossed the line. Geno suggested that if Clark truly wanted UConn, she should have been the one to call him. Let that sit for a moment. The most accomplished recruiter in women's college basketball, a coach known for identifying elite talent years ahead of everyone else, looked at Caitlin Clark and brushed her aside, then placed the responsibility on a teenager to chase him down. That was not just a misconnection. That was disrespectful. The kind of disrespect that sticks with you, that hardens inside your chest, that turns into fuel every single time you step onto floor. While Geno moved on without a second thought, Clark paid attention. She understood exactly what the situation meant. She was not their chosen star. She was not part of their plan. In his eyes, she did not fit the UConn mold. And with that mindset, can the so-called ruler of women's basketball quietly shut the door on the most important player of her generation? Looking back, it was a door he should have kept wide open. Iowa and the rise nobody saw coming. Caitlin Clark chose Iowa instead.
WNBA draft is this Monday, and Iowa star Caitlin Clark is expected to be the #1 pick.
A program without UConn's banners, without its aura, without decades of built-in power, or a trophy case that stretched across generations. What Iowa offered was something else entirely. A place where she could run the show. A place where she would be trusted from day one, empowered to make mistakes without being benched for them, and given a kind of creative freedom that lets a generational talent actually become generational. Geno never showed belief when it mattered. And that single moment of indifference became the fork in the road that redirected the entire sport. And that early dismissal did not fade with time. It did the opposite. It grew heavier with every passing season, every broken record, every sold-out arena that should have been wearing UConn blue instead of Iowa black and gold. What looked like a small recruiting miss in the moment turned into the most costly misread in women's basketball history. Not just counted in wins and losses, But in money left behind, fans lost, cultural moments missed, and a level of national attention that UConn will spend the next decade trying to recover. When Caitlin Clark committed to Iowa, few people outside the state treated it as the start of something major. Most viewed it as a backup plan, a talented kid who did not get her first choice settling for the next best thing. Iowa was not UConn. It did not carry a dynasty label or decades of dominance etched into the rafters. It was not the school that young girls circled on their wall calendars growing up dreaming about playing for someday. But Clark was never chasing someone else's history. She was chasing space. She wanted freedom. A program where she would not be squeezed into someone else's rigid system or forced to play a secondary role behind another player's spotlight. While Hall of Fame coach reminded her daily that the program was always bigger than any individual. At Iowa under head coach Lisa Bluer, she found exactly what she needed.
Head coach Lisa Bluer still holds Caitlin Clark in check.
She was not one piece of the puzzle slotted into a predetermined offensive scheme. She was a foundation from the very first practice. The program moved with her energy, not over it. Blooder handed Clark the keys and told her to drive. Hyena and that level of trust, that willingness to build an entire system around a single player's brilliance would have never existed at UConn under a coach who had spent 40 years proving that his way was the only way. It started quietly in Iowa City. Packed gyms, word spreading fast through social media feeds that could not get enough of what this kid was doing on a basketball court. Clips of her shots flooded every platform before the final buzzer even sounded. Her logo-range threes launched from well beyond the arc were not just scoring plays. They were statements that echoed across the entire sport. During her freshman season in 2020, she averaged over 26 points per game and immediately announced herself as a player who did not just belong at this level, but intended to dominate it. By her sophomore year, Anishi was leading the nation in scoring and pulling Iowa into the national conversation in ways the program had not experienced in decades. The game was changing in real time, and she was forcing everyone, coaches, networks, analysts, entire conferences to keep up or get left behind. While Geno stayed focused on guarding his legacy and protecting the narrative he had built across 4 decades of championship basketball, Clark was constructing something entirely new. Possession by possession, sellout by sellout, record by record. In her junior season, she broke the NCAA Division I all-time scoring record.
Caitlin Clark became the NCAA's all-time career scoring leader for women's basketball,
surpassing the legendary Kelsey Plum, and put her name above every player, male or female, who had ever played college basketball. That moment alone would have been enough to define a career. For Clark, it was just another Tuesday. Yes, the impact showed up in numbers that simply cannot be debated, argued with, or explained away. Iowa's home games became impossible to get tickets to. Carver Hawkeye Arena, which holds over 15,000 people, sold out repeatedly in ways the program had never seen. But the phenomenon was not limited to Iowa City. On the road, opposing arenas filled capacity with fans who had driven hours just to watch her play, even if it meant cheering against their own team. When Iowa faced LSU in the 2023 NCAA championship game, over 9 million viewers tuned in, making it the most watched women's college basketball game in history at that point. 1 year later, in the 2024 championship rematch, that number exploded to 18, 7 million, shattering every record the sport had ever set and outdrawing most men's college basketball broadcasts in the process. Ratings jumped so dramatically that ESPN and other networks restructured their entire coverage models around women's basketball for the first time. Women's basketball stopped being an afterthought buried on secondary channels at inconvenient time slots and started becoming appointment viewing for millions of people who had never watched a single game before Clark arrived. None of this happened by luck or coincidence, or because the sport was naturally trending upward on its own. Clark did not stumble into stardom. She shaped it with her own hands, her own work, and her own refusal to accept anything less than the spotlight she had earned. She did not need banners hanging from the rafters to prove her worth. She did not need approval from a coach who had overlooked her when she was 17 years old, standing in a gym in Des Moines, waiting for a phone call that never came. She took what Iowa offered and turned it into something so powerful, so undeniable, so impossible to look away from that it made UConn's dynasty look like a chapter that had already ended, undermining the rising star. While that rise unfolded in real time across every screen in America, Geno watched from a distance, and instead of acknowledging the miss, instead of simply admitting that he had gotten it wrong, and that this young woman was something special, he held his ground and leaned deeper into the decision that started it all. He chose arrogance instead of honesty and pride instead of reflection, rather than giving credit where it was obviously due. He brushed off Clark's rise and acted like it was something he'd already seen countless times before. He tried to sell the idea that nothing about her impact was special, that the hype was manufactured, that the noise would fade just like it always did. Everyone else knew better. This was different. While UConn clung to a version of dominance that was slowly fading, Clark was reshaping what dominance even looked like. She was not just stacking wins. She was changing where attention flowed, where money followed, and who held real influence in women's basketball. Young fans were no longer dreaming about wearing UConn blue. They wanted Clark's number. That shift was something Geno could not manage, could not coach his way around, and could not control. No matter how many interviews he gave, the pattern became impossible to miss. Every time Caitlin Clark's name came up in a conversation, Geno followed the same script. A quick compliment wrapped inside a subtle downgrade. He would smile and describe her as fearless. Say she played like a kid in a driveway. On the surface, it sounded kind, almost affectionate, but underneath it stripped away her brilliance. In his framing, she was not a once, in a generation talent who had spent years perfecting her craft. She was just playing around. Her mastery became casual. Her preparation became instinct. Her dominance became something ordinary that anyone with enough natural ability could replicate. He did not stop there. Anytime someone tried to place Clark in her own lane, he pulled her back into comparisons. If Clark was praised for toughness, Paige Buckers was mentioned in the same breath.